The 5 daughters stood in a silent, sorrowful line, a single pale offering against the debt their father could not pay. Cowboy Jedediah wasn't a monster. He was just a man collecting on a signed paper. He'd come for cattle or cash, not for the soul-crushing spectacle of a man bartering his own blood. He looked down the line of trembling, fair-skinned girls, their eyes cast to the cracked earth in shame. All except one. The 6th daughter, taller and broader than the rest, her skin the color of rich earth, didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a look not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated contempt. In that moment, the choice stopped being about the farmer's debt. He could take one of the broken, compliant girls and ride out, the transaction simple and clean. Or he could take the only one who looked at him not as a master, but as a man who would one day pay his own dues. The farmer began to cry. Jedediah pointed. "I'll take the fat black one." The finality of the words sucked the air from the dusty farmyard. Hannah's sisters refused to look at her, their shoulders hunched in a shared, silent relief that was a betrayal sharper than any knife. Her father, his face a mask of performative grief, wouldn't meet her eyes either. He just held out a trembling hand, into which Jedediah placed a single heavy coin, the sound of its clink against her father's palm, the sound of a closing cage door. There was no discussion, no haggling for her one small bag of belongings. Jedediah simply nodded once towards the waiting wagon, his gaze sweeping over her as if measuring the worth of his new acquisition. Hannah's contempt hardened into a cold, dense resolve. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would simply walk. She turned her back on the only home she had ever known and did not look back. The journey was a trial of silence. For 2 days, the only sounds were the groaning complaint of the wagon wheels and the flat, indifferent wind that swept across the plains. Jedediah did not speak. He drove the horses with a quiet, brutal efficiency, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his entire being a study in contained force. Hannah sat beside him, every muscle in her body tensed, her gaze fixed forward. The silence was not empty. It was a physical weight, a wall between them he had built with his choice, and she was content to let it stand. She watched the way he handled the reins, the way his hands, scarred and capable, seemed to know the horse's thoughts before they did. He was a competent man, she'd give him that. But competence without kindness was just another form of cruelty. On the 3rd morning, the unforgiving rhythm was shattered by a sharp, violent crack. The wagon lurched, tilting sickeningly to one side. A broken wheel. Jedediah was on the ground before the dust settled, his movements economical, his face a mask of cold assessment. He studied the splintered axle, a problem he understood, a problem he could solve with time and effort. Hannah watched him for a moment, then swung herself down from the wagon. She ignored his sharp, questioning glance. She walked past him, her eyes scanning the landscape, and found what she was looking for. A sturdy, fallen log and a flat, heavy river stone 100 yards away. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't explain. She simply began to work, her body a tool she had learned to use with a lifetime of thankless labor, positioning the stone, fetching the log. Jedediah stopped, his hammer in his hand, and just watched her. He saw the pure, practical physics of her idea, the raw strength she used to roll the log into position as a lever. It wasn't just brute force, it was intelligence, it was competence. Without a word, he moved to help, and for 10 minutes they worked in a perfectly synchronized, unspoken rhythm, 2 bodies solving a single concrete problem. When the wagon was lifted, the broken wheel replaced, he said nothing. He simply nodded once, a gesture of grudging acknowledgement, and they got back on the wagon. The wall of silence was still there, but now there was a single, hairline crack in it. They arrived at his ranch as the sun began to bleed across the horizon. Hannah's heart, a thing she had guarded so fiercely, sank. This was not a prosperous homestead. It was a scar on the land. The cabin was a gaunt, skeletal structure, the fences a line of broken teeth against the sky. A single wind-battered cottonwood tree stood beside a well, its branches clawing at the twilight. This was a wounded fortress, a place a man built not to live in, but to disappear inside. Jedediah brought the wagon to a halt, the silence of the valley rushing in to meet them. He swung down and finally looked at her, his face unreadable in the dying light. "This is your world now," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. "Your freedom is earned, not given." He let the words settle in the cold air between them, a final, unmerciful brand. Work or starve. The first sign of the new threat was the silence. The chickens, usually a cacophony of morning gossip, were dead quiet. Jedediah saw it the moment he stepped out of the cabin, a single, bloody clump of feathers near the coop. He followed the tracks, the large paw prints of a wolf, and his face settled into the hard, familiar lines of a man with a problem he could solve with a bullet. He spent the morning cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic metallic scrape of the cleaning rod a sound of impending, brutal efficiency. Hannah watched him from the porch, where she was mending a harness. She could feel the grim satisfaction radiating from him, the simple comfort of a direct confrontation. She had listened to the pack's howls the night before, not just a single hunter, but a family, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. A direct hunt was a fool's errand. She waited until he'd finished, until the rifle was reassembled and resting against the wall. "You hunt the one, and the 5 will be on the flock before you get back," she said, her voice even, not a challenge but a statement of fact. He turned, his eyes narrowing, ready to dismiss her. "There's a ravine north of the creek," she continued, never looking up from her work. "Narrows to a bottleneck. They use it. You can see from the tracks." He said nothing, but he didn't walk away. She had his attention. "You don't need a rifle. You need a rock slide." He stood there for a long moment, turning the geometry of her words over in his mind, seeing the map of the land she had laid out in the air. A rifle was a tool. The land itself was a weapon. Without a word, he turned, grabbed a heavy mallet and shovel, and headed towards the ravine. She had not asked. She had simply shown him a clearer picture. That night, a single, carefully orchestrated avalanche of rock and earth sealed the ravine, and the howling stopped. As they stood over the bodies of the trapped wolves, Jedediah looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze was not that of an owner inspecting an asset, but of a strategist assessing an equal. The dynamic between them, once as clear as a line in the dirt, had begun to blur. A week later, the sound of riders announced a different kind of predator. Marcus Thorne arrived not like a neighbor, but like a king inspecting his domain. He was a man made of soft leather and polished silver, his smile as bright and dangerous as a sun-flashed blade. He swung down from his horse, his 2 hired guns remaining mounted, their hands never straying far from their pistols. "Stone," Thorne boomed, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet valley. "Still clinging to this rock, I see." Jedediah just nodded, his body a solid, unmoving wall of granite. Thorne's eyes slid past him and landed on Hannah as she carried a bucket of water from the well. His smile widened. "Well, well, you finally got yourself some help. And sturdy help at that." He looked her up and down, a slow, proprietary appraisal that stripped her bare. "I can see the appeal, no delicate flower to wilt in the sun." The subtext was a physical blow. This is what a man like you is reduced to. Jedediah's jaw was a cord of hardened muscle, but he said nothing. Thorne took a step closer to Hannah. "Tell me, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. "Does he treat you well? A man gets lonely out here, has unusual needs." In that instant, everything changed. Before the last word left Thorne's mouth, Jedediah moved. It was not a lunge or a charge, but a single, silent step that placed his body squarely between Thorne and Hannah. The air crackled with a sudden lethal energy. Jedediah didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply looked at Thorne, and the cold, flat emptiness in his eyes was more terrifying than any weapon. "You are not welcome on my land," he said, the words as quiet and final as a closing grave. Thorne's smile never faltered, but his eyes went cold. He held Jedediah's gaze for a heartbeat, then chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "As you wish," he said, turning to remount his horse. "A man ought to protect his property, after all." He rode away, leaving the chilling certainty that this was not an end, but a declaration of war. The retaliation, when it came, was silent and insidious. It began with a dead cow, its body bloated and still by the edge of the well. Then another. There was no bullet wound, no sign of a predator. Just a strange, milky film on the surface of the water and the sickly sweet smell of decay. The well was poisoned. The one thing they could not live without, the very heart of the ranch, had been turned to venom. The attack was crippling, a blow aimed not at Jedediah's body, but at the fragile hope of survival they had begun to build. Despair, thick and suffocating as the mud at the bottom of a dying creek, began to settle over the homestead. As if summoned by their misery, the sky turned a bruised, ugly gray. The wind, once a constant, indifferent companion, began to howl with a new, vicious intelligence. A freak blizzard descended on the valley, a swirling vortex of white that swallowed the world. They barricaded themselves in the cabin, the wind shrieking through the log walls like a banshee. For Jedediah, the sound was a ghost. He sat by the dying fire, staring into the flames, but Hannah could see he was 1,000 miles and 10 years away, trapped in another storm. The fortress he had built against the world was a prison, but the fortress inside his mind had just been breached. By morning, a fever had taken hold. He was consumed by a shivering fire, his body racked with tremors, his nightmares spilling out into the frozen air of the cabin in ragged, broken whispers. His strength, his competence, all of it was gone, burned away by the poison from the well and the poison from his past. He had failed. All his walls, all his rules had amounted to nothing. The fortress had fallen. As Jedediah collapsed into the depths of his fever, Hannah looked out the small frosted window at the endless churning white. The world had been erased. There was no escape. There was no one coming to help. She looked back at the broken man shivering in his cot, a man who had bought her like cattle, and in the face of absolute despair, she felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. She barred the door against the storm, stoked the fire until it roared back to life, and began, with a slow, deliberate purpose, to tear clean strips of cloth from her own petticoat. The fight was not over. It had just begun. The blizzard was a living thing, a mindless, shrieking predator clawing at the walls of the cabin. Inside, another storm raged. Jedediah burned with a fever that was part poison, part memory. For 2 days, Hannah was the sole guardian of his life, a sentinel moving through the flickering firelight. She was the one who forced water between his cracked lips, who packed snow against his burning skin, who listened to the ghosts that poured out of him in ragged, fever-breathed whispers. He spoke of a woman named Eleanor, of a love that was a fragile, beautiful thing, like a flower in a stone jar. He spoke of another blizzard, of a journey they should never have made. "So delicate," he mumbled, his hands clenching the rough blanket. "Couldn't keep her warm. Too cold." And then, the words that cracked the fortress of his soul wide open, "My fault." Hannah listened, her hands never ceasing their work, and the final piece of the puzzle of Jedediah Stone slid into place. It was not pity she felt, but a profound, shattering moment of clarity. He hadn't chosen her because she was strong enough to work. He had chosen her because he believed she was strong enough to survive. His cold, brutal choice had not been an act of cruelty. It was an act of penance, a desperate, unconscious attempt to rewrite the ending of his life's greatest failure. When the fever broke on the 3rd day, Jedediah woke to the smell of broth and the sight of Hannah sitting by the fire, her silhouette calm and steady against the dying rage of the storm outside. He was weak, his body hollowed out, but his mind was clear for the first time in a decade. He saw her, not as the woman he had bought, but as the woman who had just pulled him back from the grave. The silence that settled between them was different now, stripped of its weight and its walls. "He knew," Jedediah said, his voice a dry rasp. "Thorn. Poisoning the well wasn't about killing the cattle, it was about killing the ranch before the snows hit. He wanted to make sure we couldn't last the winter." Hannah looked at him, her eyes sharp, and saw the strategist reborn. "The winter isn't over yet," she said. It was not a question. It was a vow. The debt was forgotten. A new plan was forged in the quiet of the snowbound cabin, not just to survive, but to win. The winter was long and hard, a silent war waged against starvation and cold. But it was not a winter of despair. It was a crucible that burned away the last vestiges of their old roles. They worked as a single unit, their rhythms so perfectly synchronized they barely needed to speak. He taught her how to read the traps in the snow. She taught him how to read the herbs in the healing. By the time the first tentative green shoots of spring pushed through the thawing earth, they were no longer a master and his debtor. They were partners, a team, and they were ready for their own spring offensive. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper of moving water. Using their combined knowledge, they spent a week building a series of small, clever diversions in the upper creek that fed the valley, redirecting a steady, life-giving flow of meltwater away from Thorne's vast, thirsty pastures and towards their own recovering land. It was a slow, invisible act of war. Next, they targeted his workforce. They didn't need to fight Thorne's hired guns, they just needed to give them a reason to leave. A carefully placed rumor, started by Jedediah in a town 50 miles away, of a new, rich silver strike in the Northern Territories, was all it took. Within a month, Thorne's less loyal men had deserted him, lured away by the promise of easier money. The final move was one of pure, devastating strategy. Jedediah rode to the territorial capital, not with a gun, but with a leather satchel containing the original wax-sealed survey maps for his land, passed down from his father. He presented them to the U.S. Marshal, laying them beside Thorne's forged, backdated claims. It was a quiet, intellectual checkmate. The final confrontation took place not on a dusty street at high noon, but in Thorne's own opulent study. He watched, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, as the marshal calmly explained how his empire, built on a foundation of lies, had just been legally and irrevocably dismantled. Thorne was ruined, not by a bullet, but by a better plan. When Jedediah returned, he found Hannah by the newly cleansed well, the water now running clear and deep. The land was healing. They were healing. He held out a piece of paper, a legal deed, crisp and official. "It's yours," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "A quarter section, by the creek. Your freedom. It's paid." Hannah looked at the deed, the written proof of the freedom she had fought so hard for. Then she looked at him, at the man who had seen her when no one else would. She gently pushed the paper back towards him. "I thought my spirit was a weapon I used to survive," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "But I think it's the light I use to build a home." He understood. He understood everything. He took her hand, and the simple touch was more profound than any kiss. They stood for a moment, not looking at each other, but out at the valley, their valley, vibrant and green, with the promise of a future. Later that afternoon, they walked out to the edge of the west pasture, carrying a heavy mallet and a sharpened fence post. They worked together, their movements a familiar practiced rhythm, to drive the post deep into the rich, dark earth. It was the first post of a new fence, the first line of a new map, the foundation of a legacy built not on a debt, but on a partnership of two unbroken survivors.